America's founders fought a war for liberty. A century later, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren decided liberty was too dangerous when it came in a bottle. The result? The 18th Amendment. The first and only time the Constitution stripped away a freedom instead of protecting it. It was supposed to make America more moral, more sober, and more righteous. Instead, it unleashed gangsters with Tommy guns, police on the take, and more more booze flowing than ever. 14 years later, the 21st Amendment stepped in with the constitutional equivalent of our bad, and the whole thing was done. So this is the story of Prohibition, a social crusade that gave us gangsters, speakeasies, and Al Capone, and how it blew up in America's face. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band that kept
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
We pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So the 18th Amendment from 1919. Here's what it says. And this is shortened. I shortened it because it's pretty long. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Why did America go dry? The temperance movement had been building since the early 1800s. Ministers and reformers argued alcohol destroyed families, wrecked morality, and fueled crime. Women's groups, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, claimed banning liquor would protect wives and children from drunk, abusive husbands. Progressive reformers saw alcohol as the root of poverty and corruption, and then World War I sealed the deal. Brewing used grain that was needed for food, and many breweries were German-owned. Making beer seemed unpatriotic. So by 1919, they had enough momentum to push through the 18th Amendment. And that brought along what's called the Volstead Act. That was the law that enforced the 18th Amendment. It also was passed in 1919, and the Volstead Act gave the details. Intoxicating liquor meant anything stronger than 0.5% alcohol. No loopholes for beer or wine. They were banned too. Exceptions: religious wine and medical alcohol, which is why suddenly everyone had a doctor's prescription for whiskey, was allowed. What Prohibition actually looked like. On paper, America went dry. In reality, speakeasies, secret clubs, exploded in every city. New York alone had an estimated 30,000. Bootlegging became a national industry, with smugglers moving liquor across borders and state lines. Organized crime skyrocketed. Al Capone and other mob bosses built empires on illegal liquor, making millions of dollars. And then corruption. It infected a lot of law enforcement. Police and politicians took bribes to look other ways. So the result? Instead of curing social ills, prohibition fueled crime, violence, and disrespect for the law. Now, that brings us to the 21st Amendment from 1933. The 18th Article of the Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. Why America reversed the course? So let's talk about that. By the 1930s, the Great Depression crushed the economy. Legal alcohol meant new jobs, new tax revenue, and less money flowing into organized crime. And public opinion had flipped. Americans were tired of hypocrisy, tired of politicians preaching dry while drinking in private. Sounds a little bit like COVID, where they were saying, keep 6 feet apart while having orgies together. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president in 1932 and repealed it with repeal as part of his platform. And what it did, Prohibition ended. Americans could buy, sell, and drink alcohol legally, but states kept control. The 21st Amendment let states regulate alcohol however they wanted, which is why even today some counties are still dry. I actually grew up in a dry town, Monmouth, Oregon. It's not dry anymore, but you had two towns, Monmouth and Independence, right? They were literally connected by this little S curve. And Monmouth was a college town. It's where I think it's Western Oregon University. You could literally drive half a mile in Independence, buy alcohol, and come back. But you couldn't buy or sell it in Monmouth. It was weird. Anyway, the 21st Amendment remains the only amendment ever passed to erase another. So the legacy of Prohibition and its repeal, right? The unintended consequences. Instead of solving crime, it created criminal empires. And instead of protecting families, it fueled corruption and violence, right? And then there was this cultural shift in the 1920s, which became the Roaring Twenties, right? With flappers, jabs, speakeasies flourished in defiance to the law. So the constitutional lesson here is the amendments proved the Constitution isn't static. Americans can try bold experiments, admit mistakes, and fix them with another amendment, right? I prefer, instead of hindsight is 2020, I prefer us as Americans to use our brains before we go and start trying to do amendments like the 18th, right? But the 18th Amendment was supposed to sober Americans up. Instead, it handed men like Al Capone, Bugs Moran, Arnold Rothstein, Dutch Schultz, and Lucky Luciano the keys to build an empire on bootlegging, bullets, and bribes. When the dust settled, the 21st Amendment had to clean up the mess, proving once again that laws can't erase human nature. They just simply redirect it. I really appreciate you taking time to listen. Remember, history isn't boring, especially when one amendment turned ordinary crooks into the legends of organized crime. See you next time.